Hartmere Hall had not heard music in 18 months. This was not an accident of neglect or a lapse in custom. It was law, as binding and unyielding as any statute carved into the walls of Parliament. The 7th Duke of Hartmere had decreed it on the night they lowered his wife into the cold Somerset earth, and from that hour forward not a note had been played, not a hymn had been hummed, not a melody of any kind had disturbed the suffocating quiet of the great house. The pianoforte in the morning room had been draped in black cloth. The harp in the east salon had been carried to the attic. The music room on the 2nd floor, where the late Duchess Elspeth had once filled the corridors with a voice so pure it made the footmen pause in their duties, had been locked. The key hung on the Duke's own chain, pressed against his chest like a wound he refused to let heal. The staff understood. They spoke in murmurs. They moved in soft shoes. They swallowed their laughter and saved their songs for the walk home. The rule was never written down because it did not need to be. Everyone who served at Hartmere knew it, the way they knew not to touch a hot stove. You felt it in the walls, in the air, in the way the Duke's dark gaze would sharpen at the slightest unexpected sound. And then it was written down. The notice appeared on the baize board in the servants' quarter on a gray morning in late October, penned in Mrs. Crane's meticulous copper plate, the ink so fresh it glistened under the lamplight. It was placed above all other notices, pinned with 2 brass tacks instead of the customary one, and separated from the mundane schedules below it by a thick black line drawn with a ruler. No singing, humming, whistling, or music of any kind is permitted within the walls or grounds of Hartmere Hall. Violation will result in immediate dismissal, without character. The staff gathered around it in 2s and 3s throughout the morning, reading it with the grim familiarity of people who already knew its contents but understood that the act of writing it down changed everything. An unspoken rule could be bent. A posted rule could not. Something had happened. Someone had broken the silence, and every servant in Hartmere Hall knew exactly who it was. Her name was Nell. She had arrived less than a fortnight ago on the afternoon coach from Taunton with a single trunk, a letter of reference that described her as quiet, capable, and unlikely to cause trouble, and a face so carefully composed it might have been carved from the same pale limestone as the house itself. Mrs. Crane, the housekeeper, had read the reference, inspected the girl with the practiced eye of a woman who had hired and dismissed more servants than she could count, and found nothing objectionable. She was small, neat, and unremarkable, with dark hair pulled back beneath a plain cap and eyes the color of slate after rain. She looked like exactly what she claimed to be: an orphan, a nobody, grateful for the work. She was none of those things, but the house did not know that yet, and so Nell was given a bed in the attic dormitory, a gray uniform 2 sizes too large, and a list of duties that began before dawn and ended when the last candle was snuffed. She learned the geography of the great house in days. The vast stone kitchens below ground, the great hall with its hammer-beam ceiling and ancestral portraits in oils so dark the faces seemed to retreat into shadow. The library, 2 stories of leather and silence, where the Duke spent most of his waking hours, and the 2nd-floor corridor that ended at a locked door, behind which lay the music room, sealed, untouched, a tomb within a tomb. She learned the rhythms of the staff, who gossiped and who could be trusted. She learned that the cook, Bertha, was kind in the mornings and unpredictable by the afternoon, that the first footman, Oswin, was Mrs. So. Crane's creature with ambitions above his station and a habit of eavesdropping at keyholes. The second housemaid, Freda, was timid but not unkind, and the hallboy, Jem, sang to himself under his breath when he thought no one could hear. She learned the rules. She memorized them. She obeyed them without complaint or question. But the first rule, the great rule, the one that Mrs. Crane had underlined twice and posted in letters large enough to read from across the corridor, was the one she could not always keep, because Nell had been singing her entire life. not as a pastime or a parlor trick, but as an instinct, as involuntary, as breathing. Her voice had been trained before she could read, shaped and refined by the finest teacher she would ever know, a man who believed that music was not something you learned, but something you were, something that lived in the body the way blood lives in the veins, constant and unchosen. That man was dead now, and so was the life he had given her. But the voice remained. It lived in her throat like a caged bird, pressing against the bars, waiting for the smallest lapse in attention to slip free. She kept it caged. She pressed her lips together as she scrubbed the flagstones. She bit the inside of her cheek as she polished the brass. She filled her mind with lists, with numbers, with the grinding inventory of her tasks, anything to keep the melody from rising. At night, in the attic dormitory, she buried her face in her pillow and mouthed the words of her father's composition silently, her lips moving against the rough cotton, the music alive in her mind but trapped behind her teeth. For 11 days it worked. On the 12th morning, she was alone. She had been assigned to the upper floors that week, dusting the ornamental sconces and picture frames in the East Wing corridor. It was barely past 6. The house was wrapped in its gray pre-dawn quiet, the other maids still, 2 floors below laying fires and setting the breakfast trays. The family wing was empty. The Duke, she knew from careful observation, never rose before 8. She was safe. She was utterly alone, and the corridor smelled of something that undid her. It was faint, barely there, seeping from beneath the locked door of the music room at the far end of the passage. Rosin. Dried lavender. The particular warm dust of a room that had once been filled with instruments and life. It was the smell of her childhood. The smell of her father's study, of Sunday mornings at the pianoforte, of ink on manuscript paper, of a world that had been stolen from her so completely she sometimes doubted it had ever existed. The melody came before she knew it was coming. It began as a hum, barely audible, 5 notes of a lullaby her father had composed for her when she was small, then 6 notes. Then the hum opened into something fuller, a soft, clear tone that floated from her lips and filled the stone corridor with a sound so pure and so utterly out of place in that dead, silent house that it seemed almost to glow. She did not hear herself. That was the cruelty of it. She was lost in the rhythm of her work, and the voice simply rose, the way steam rises from a cup unasked for, unstoppable, as natural and as dangerous as a heartbeat. The sound did what sound does in a house built of stone and silence. It traveled. It curled down the corridor and found the main staircase, descended past 6 generations of Ashworths watching from their gilded frames, and threaded itself through the library door, which stood ajar as it always did in the early hours. The Duke was inside. Calder Ashworth had not slept. He had been at his desk since before 3, his pen moving across column after column of tenant accounts. He was a man of 32 who looked a decade older, not in his body, which was tall and lean, but in his eyes. They were the color of winter oak, deep brown shot through with amber, and they held the flat exhaustion of a man who had replaced sleep with work and called it duty. He heard the voice. His pen stopped. The nib hung above the page, a bead of ink swelling at its tip, and in the sudden absence of that small mechanical scratching, the melody filled the room. It was distant, muffled by stone and timber, but it was unmistakable. A woman's voice, singing somewhere in the upper reaches of the house, singing in Hartmere Hall. His hand tightened on the pen until his knuckles went white. The sound struck him the way a physical blow strikes, a sharp, disorienting impact somewhere behind his sternum that radiated outward into his ribs, his throat, the backs of his eyes. It was not the melody itself, which was simple and unfamiliar. It was the quality of the voice. Clear, trained, instinctive, a voice that knew what it was doing even when its owner did not. It reminded him of Elspeth. Not a copy, not an echo. something different, raw and less polished, but carrying the same effortless truth that his wife had possessed, that quality she had once described to him as the removal of all pretense. The voice simply becoming what it was, without apology, without performance. This was that unguarded, unadorned, and it was shattering him. He stood. His chair scraped against the floor, a sound that would normally make him wince, but he did not hear it. The melody was already fading, the last notes dissolving into the stone, the way water dissolves into sand, but the direction was clear. Upstairs. The East Wing. He crossed the library in 4 strides and entered the great hall. The staircase rose before him in the gray light, and he took it with a speed that startled him, his hand gripping the oak banister, his heart doing something it had not done in 18 months. It was beating fast. He reached the first-floor landing. Silence. He continued to the 2nd floor and turned into the East Wing corridor. It was empty. The sconces gleamed dully in the early light. The locked door of the music room was shut and undisturbed. There was no one here, but there had been someone. He could feel it, the way you feel the warmth left behind in a chair after someone has risen. A presence, recently departed, and with it, the faintest trace of that melody still hanging in the air like the last wisp of incense in a church. He stood in the empty corridor, one hand pressed flat against the cold stone wall, breathing harder than the climb warranted. He did not know what he was feeling. It was too large, too tangled, too dangerous to name. Grief. Yes, always grief, but threaded through it now. Something new. Something that felt terrifyingly close to longing. He returned to the library. He sat at his desk and stared at his drainage surveys until the numbers blurred. The silence settled around him again, thick and absolute. But it was different now. It had a crack in it. Downstairs, the crack had already become a crisis. Nell did not know she had been heard by the Duke, but she knew, with the cold certainty of a mistake that cannot be taken back, that she had been heard. The moment the last note left her lips, she had frozen, her cloth pressed flat against the brass sconce. Her breath stopped, dead in her chest. The silence that followed was louder than any sound she had ever made. She had looked down the corridor, first one direction, then the other, and seen no one. She had returned to her work with trembling hands, furious with herself, sick with the knowledge that 11 days of discipline had been undone by a single unguarded moment. But she had not been as alone as she believed. Oswin, the first footman, had been in the service stairwell at the far end of the corridor retrieving a tea tray he had neglected the previous evening. He had heard every note, and Oswin, whose loyalty to Mrs. Paulev Crane was exceeded only by his appetite for her approval, had gone directly to the housekeeper's parlor before the echo had finished dying. By midday, the household knew. The whispers moved through the kitchens like a draft under a door, gathering detail and embellishment as they went. The new girl had been singing, of all things, in the East Wing, outside the music room, on the very threshold of the Duke's grief. It was Bear who warned her. She found Nell in the scullery, up to her elbows in grease and cold gray water, scrubbing the roasting pans from the previous night's dinner. "You had best prepare yourself, girl," Bertha said, her broad face stripped of its usual warmth. "Oswin has been to Crane. She is on the warpath, and you are the path." Nell's stomach dropped, but her face did not move. She had learned, through long and bitter practice, to keep her expression as still as water in a basin, to give nothing, to show nothing, to survive. "I see," she said quietly. "Thank you for telling me." "I do not tell you for thanks," Bertha said, lowering her voice and glancing over her shoulder. "I tell you because that woman has broken better girls than you, and she enjoys the breaking. She collects it, the way some women collect china. Watch yourself." The summons came within the hour. Freda, the second housemaid, appeared in the scullery doorway, her face pale and pinched with second-hand dread. Mrs. Crane wants you. In her parlor. Now, Nell dried her hands on a rough cloth, smoothed her apron, and followed Frida through the labyrinth of service corridors to the housekeeper's domain. Mrs. Crane's parlor was a small dark room at the heart of the servants' wing, furnished with a desk, a single straight-backed chair, and one narrow window that looked onto a stone courtyard where nothing grew. It was a room built for judgment, and it served its purpose without apology. Mrs. Crane was standing behind her desk. She was a tall, angular woman with iron-gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin at her temples. Her face was narrow and precise, the face of a woman who had spent decades cataloging the failures of others and had elevated the practice to an art. Her eyes were pale blue, almost colorless, the blue of ice in a gutter, and they held neither warmth nor curiosity, only authority. She did not invite Nell to sit. She did not greet her. She did not waste a single word. "You were heard singing this morning," she said. Her voice was a blade wrapped in linen, smooth and quiet and lethally precise. "In the East Wing, outside the music room. Yes, Mrs. Crane." There was no point in denial. Denial would only extend the encounter and give the woman more surface to cut with. "You have been in this house for less than a fortnight. In that time, you have broken the first and most important rule of this household, a rule that exists for reasons you are neither entitled to know nor capable of understanding, a rule that protects this house and the man who owns it from a disruption you cannot begin to fathom." Mrs. Crane paused. She placed both hands flat on the desk and leaned forward, her pale eyes fixed on Nell's face with an intensity that was clearly designed to make the girl flinch. Nell did not flinch. "It will not happen again, Mrs. Crane," she said. Her voice was steady, her gaze fixed on a point just below the housekeeper's chin. She stood the way she always stood when under assault, straight-backed, hands clasped, weight evenly distributed, as if she were a tree that had learned long ago how to take the wind without bending. The housekeeper studied her. There was something in the girl's composure that snagged at her attention like a thorn on silk. Servants, when reprimanded, were supposed to crumble. They were supposed to stammer and weep and stare at the floor. This girl did none of those things. She absorbed the blow the way stone absorbs rain, without reaction, without apology. It was wrong. It was, if Mrs. Crane had been honest with herself, deeply unsettling. This was not the posture of a girl who had scrubbed floors since childhood. This was the posture of a woman accustomed to standing her ground, a woman who had been trained to meet authority without shrinking from it. But Mrs. Crane was not an honest woman. She was a thorough one, and thorough women do not question what unsettles them. They eliminate it. "If it happens again," she said, straightening, "you will be dismissed without character, without wages owed, without a single word of explanation to any future household that inquires about your service. You will leave Hartmere with nothing. Is that understood?" "It is understood. You are reassigned from the upper floors, effective immediately. You will not set foot above the ground floor again. You will report to the laundry. You will make yourself useful, and you will make yourself silent. Those are your only two obligations in this house from this moment forward." Nell inclined her head, a precise, measured movement. "Yes, Mrs. Crane." She turned and left the parlor. The door closed behind her with a soft click. In the corridor, she pressed her back against the cold stone wall and closed her eyes. Her heart, which had maintained its slow, steady rhythm throughout the entire encounter, now hammered against her ribs with a violence that made the edges of her vision darken. She had survived. She still had her position. She still had a roof over her head and meals in her stomach and access to the house, however diminished. But she had lost the upper floors. She had lost the East Wing. She had lost the corridor that led to the one door in this house she needed to open. The music room. Her father's legacy was behind that locked door. She was certain of it, as certain as she was of her own name, her real name, the one she had buried beneath the drab uniform and the downcast eyes and the practiced, impenetrable stillness. Her name was not Nell. Her name was Tamsin Lidcott, and she had come to Hartmere Hall not for a maid's wages, but for everything that had been taken from her. Her father, Matthias Lidcott, had been one of the most respected composers and music scholars of his generation. His collection of original manuscripts gathered over 30 years was valued at a fortune. He had also owned a beloved property in Cornwall, a stone cottage on the cliffs above Porthaven, where the sound of the sea came through the windows like a hymn, where Tamsin had spent every summer of her childhood learning to sing. Matthias had died 2 years ago. He had been ill for some time, and he had used his final months to put his affairs in order, or so he had believed. His will was clear. Everything, the manuscripts, the cottage, the modest savings, went to his only child, Tamsin. But she had never seen a penny of it. A distant cousin of her mother's, a man named Horace Crane, had appeared within days of the funeral with a second will, one that left the bulk of the estate to him. His solicitor had declared it valid. The witnesses were Horace's associates. The original will had vanished. Horace had taken everything. The manuscripts, the cottage, the savings. He had cast Tamsin out with a handful of coins and a warning that any attempt to contest the arrangement would result in consequences she would find most unpleasant. She had been 19 years old, alone, and utterly without recourse. And Mrs. Crane, the housekeeper of Hartmere Hall, was Horace Crane's sister. Tamsin had spent a year in destitution, working as a seamstress, a laundress, a tutor. She had not sung. The voice that had been her father's greatest pride had gone silent, locked away as thoroughly as the music room at Hartmere. Then a letter had found her, from an old colleague of her father's, a retired professor named Idavain. He believed Matthias had hidden his most important document somewhere safe before his death. And Idavain remembered that Matthias had been cataloging the private musical collection at Hartmere Hall. The late Duchess herself had been his most celebrated student. If Matthias had wanted to hide something, Idavain wrote, there was no safer place than the private music room of a duchess who had been both his patron and his friend. It was a thread, a single fragile thread. But it was all she had. So Tamsin Lidcott had disappeared, and Nell, a quiet, capable orphan with forged references and a face trained to reveal nothing, had taken her place. She had walked into the very house governed by her enemy's sister, and she had begun to search. Less than a fortnight she had been here. Less than a fortnight of scrubbing and polishing, and bowing her head and swallowing her pride and keeping her voice, her traitorous, irrepressible voice locked behind her teeth. And now, because of one unguarded moment, one lapse in a corridor that smelled like home, she had lost access to the only part of the house that mattered. She opened her eyes. She straightened her spine. She smoothed her apron with hands that had finally stopped trembling. She would find another way. She had not survived 2 years of dispossession, humiliation, and grief to be defeated by a locked door and a housekeeper's malice. The music room was still there. The proof was still inside it. And she was still inside this house. She walked to the laundry with her usual measured pace, her expression as blank and unreadable as the limestone walls around her. She did not sing, but somewhere above her, in the silent library on the ground floor, a man who had not felt anything in 18 months sat motionless at his desk, a forgotten pen in his hand, and listened to the memory of a voice he could not explain and could not stop hearing. And in the housekeeper's parlor, Mrs. Crane sat alone, staring at the door the girl had just closed behind her, and felt something she had not felt in 20 years of unchallenged authority. She felt afraid. The days that followed were a study in erasure. Nell was moved to the laundry, a low-ceilinged room in the basement where the air hung thick with lye and wet linen, and the windows showed nothing but a strip of gray sky, sheets to be boiled, linens to be wrung through the mangle, petticoats starched and pressed until her fingers cracked. She was sealed away in a white, steaming underworld, where no one visited and no one asked how she was. It was precisely what Mrs. Crane had intended, out of sight, out of mind, out of the corridors where she might be heard. But erasure, Nell was learning, only works when the person doing the erasing controls every eye in the house, and Mrs. Master. Crane did not control the Dukes. Calder did not understand what was happening to him. It was more like an irritation, a splinter lodged beneath the skin of his concentration that he could not locate or extract. He went about his duties with his customary precision. He rode the estate. He reviewed the accounts. But in the margins of his day, in the moments between tasks, he found himself listening, not for the voice. He told himself that firmly. But he was aware, in a way he had not been before, of the quality of the silence. It had always been his armor, the barrier between himself and the unbearable memory of Elspeth at the pianoforte, of Elspeth humming in the garden with her hair coming loose from its pins. Now it felt like a wound. He noticed things he had never noticed before. The way servants moved in a hunched, anticipatory crouch, the way laughter was immediately stifled, the way the house absorbs sound, the way a tomb absorbs light. And he noticed the girl's absence. She had been a peripheral presence since her arrival, a small gray figure moving through his field of vision with her cloth and her bucket, silent and efficient and forgettable. He had not registered her consciously, but now that she was gone from the upper floors, he felt the gap she had left, the way you feel, a missing tooth, a space where something small but definite had been. He found himself walking past the laundry corridor more often than his duties required. He told himself he was inspecting the condition of the basement rooms. He told himself it was part of his responsibility as master of the house. These were lies, and he knew it, but they were useful lies, the kind that allow a proud man to do something he cannot yet admit to wanting. Through the half-open door he saw her. She was standing at the great mangle, feeding a sheet through the wooden rollers with a steady, rhythmic motion. Her sleeves were pushed above her elbows. Her hair had escaped its cap in dark, damp tendrils that clung to her neck. She was working with the same quiet, unbreakable focus he had observed in her before, as if the act of labor was not a burden but a discipline, a way of holding the self together when everything else had come apart. She did not see him. She did not know he was there. And in that moment of unobserved observation, Calder felt something shift inside him, a tectonic movement, slow and deep, like the first fracture in a dam that has held for too long. But he walked away before she could look up. He returned to the library and closed the door. He stood at the tall window that overlooked the south lawn and pressed his forehead against the cold glass. That evening he did something he had not done since the week of Elspeth's funeral. He took the key from his chain and climbed the stairs to the second floor. He walked the east wing corridor, his footsteps loud in the empty passage, and stopped before the locked door of the music room. He did not open it. He stood with the key in his hand, his thumb running over its cold teeth. The girl had been standing here, right here, singing. Mrs. Crane had called it reckless, presumptuous, but what he had heard was not reckless. It was involuntary, something escaping, not something performed. A bird released from a cage does not choose to fly. It simply flies, because that is what it is. He put the key back on his chain. He went to bed. He did not sleep. The question followed him into the dark and would not let him rest. Who sings like that? Not who sings in a house where singing is forbidden, but who sings like that at all, with that kind of training, that kind of depth. Who was she? The answer, or at least the first thread that would eventually lead to it, arrived 3 days later in the form of a carriage, a quantity of expensive luggage, and the most formidable woman Calder had ever known. Lady Dorothea Ashworth, his father's eldest sister, descended upon Hartmere Hall with the inevitability of weather. She did not write ahead. She did not send word through the usual channels. She simply appeared, as she had always appeared, at moments of family crisis with her iron gray curls pinned beneath a traveling hat of alarming dimensions, and her small, fierce eyes already cataloging every detail of the world around her. She was 71 years old. She had survived 3 husbands, 2 wars, and a fall from a horse at 68 that should have killed her. She walked with a silver-handled cane that she used less for support than for emphasis, rapping it against floors and occasionally the shins of people who displeased her. She loved her nephew with the fierce love of a woman who had no children of her own. She had not visited Hartmere since Elspeth's funeral. She had given Calder time to navigate his grief, but reports had reached her, and they painted a picture she found unacceptable. The house was a mausoleum. The Duke was a ghost. Something had to be done. "This house smells like a crypt," she announced, standing in the great hall, peeling off her gloves and looking around with an expression of theatrical dismay. "The air in here is older than I am, Aunt Dorothea." Calder descended the staircase to greet her, his face arranged into the neutral mask he wore for all social encounters. "You might have written. If I had written, you would have invented a reason to be elsewhere. Boy, you have your father's gift for strategic absence." She rapped her cane on the flagstones and looked up at him with eyes that missed nothing. "You look dreadful." "Have you slept this year?" "I sleep adequately." "You lie inadequately. Take me to a fire and pour me something strong. We are going to have a conversation you will not enjoy." He did as he was told. He installed her in the small drawing room and poured her a measure of brandy. She drank. She looked around the room, noting the absence of flowers, the heavy curtains half drawn. She noted her nephew's hollowed cheeks and the dark smudges beneath his eyes. "Where is the pianoforte that used to stand in the morning room?" she asked. "In storage. And the harp? The attic? And the music room?" "Locked." Lady Dorothea set down her glass with a deliberate clink. "And the staff? Are they permitted to whistle while they work, to hum a hymn on a Sunday, to sing their children to sleep in the servants' quarters?" Calder's jaw tightened. "You know the answer." "I do. I have read the charming little notice on the board downstairs. No singing, humming, or whistling. Violation results in dismissal. It reads like a decree from a medieval monastery, Calder, except that monks at least have the grace to channel their silence into prayer." She fixed him with a gaze that would have made a lesser man flinch. "What have you channeled yours into?" "Work, work," she repeated, tasting the word as if it were sour. "Work is not a substitute for living, Calder. It is a way of avoiding it. You have turned this house into a monument to your wife, and in doing so, you have made it uninhabitable. Elspeth would be horrified." The name struck him like a slap. He turned to the window, his back rigid, his hands clasped behind him so tightly the tendons stood out like cords. "You did not know her as I did," he said, his voice low and strained. "You do not know what this house was when she was alive." "I knew her very well," his aunt said, her voice softening for the first time. "If you recall, I introduced you, and I know this. She was a woman who filled rooms with sound and light and laughter. She would not have wanted her home turned into a tomb. She would not have wanted her husband to become a man who punishes his household for the crime of being alive." Calder did not turn from the window. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, a dark, hollowed shape against the gray afternoon. "Silence is not honor, Calder," Lady Dorothea said, each word placed with the precision of a surgeon's blade. "It is punishment. You are punishing this house for losing her, and you are punishing yourself, most of all. And I have heard that you are punishing a girl, a new maid, who committed the unforgivable sin of singing while she worked." He turned sharply. "Who told you that? I have been here less than 2 hours, and I have already heard the story 3 times. The servants talk, Calder. They always talk. The girl sang. Your housekeeper banished her to the laundry, and you, the master of this house, allowed it. Mrs. Crane manages the household. I do not interfere in domestic matters." "Then you should begin," his aunt said sharply, "because your Mrs. Crane is not managing. She is ruling, and there is a vast difference. I met the girl just now. the one who brought up my luggage. Small, dark-haired, very quiet. She carried my heaviest trunk up 2 flights of stairs, without complaint and without assistance. And when she set it down, she did not gasp or lean against the wall. She straightened her back and asked if I required anything else. Lady Dorothea paused, her sharp eyes fixed on her nephew's face. That girl has the bearing of someone who was not born to carry trunks. Her hands are a laundress's hands, but her posture is not. Her deference is learned, Calder, not bred. I have spent 71 years reading people, and that girl is a page written in invisible ink. There is more to her than what you see. Calder said nothing. His aunt's words landed in the same place the voice had landed, somewhere behind his sternum, in a region he had thought was sealed shut. "You heard her, didn't you?" Lady Dorothea said quietly. "You heard her sing." The silence that followed was the loudest sound in the room. "Yes," he said at last. The word dragged from him like a splinter from deep tissue. "I heard her, and—" he closed his eyes. It was like hearing a door open in a house where every door has been locked. His aunt rose from her chair. She crossed the room and placed her hand on his arm. The first physical contact he had allowed from anyone since Elspeth's death. He did not pull away. "Then perhaps," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "it is time to stop locking the doors." He had no answer for her. She did not expect one. She squeezed his arm, picked up her cane, and left him standing at the window, staring out at the fading light, feeling the foundations of his carefully constructed fortress beginning, at last, to shift. That evening, Nell was summoned to serve dinner. Lady Dorothea had specifically asked for the quiet girl with the dark hair, and her requests were not requests. Nell poured wine. She cleared plates. She moved with silent efficiency. But she was aware, with every nerve in her body, that 2 pairs of eyes were on her. The Duke's, dark and unreadable, and Lady Dorothea's, bright and uncomfortably perceptive. As she carried the dessert tray back to the service corridor, Lady Dorothea's voice followed her through the half-closed door. "She moves like a musician, Calder. Have you noticed? Musicians always move with that particular awareness of their own bodies. They cannot help it. It is bred into the muscle." Nell did not stop walking. She did not look back. She carried the tray to the kitchens with her usual measured pace, set it on the table, and walked to the small courtyard behind the scullery where the maids took their air. She stood in the cold October dark and breathed. Lady Dorothea was dangerous. A kind danger, perhaps, but danger nonetheless. The old woman saw too much. She asked too many questions. She pulled at threads that could not afford to be pulled. And worse, she had drawn the Duke's attention directly to Nell in a way that Mrs. Crane's punishment had not. The housekeeper had tried to make her invisible. The Duke's aunt was making her visible, deliberately, insistently, placing her under a light that Nell could not afford to stand in. Time was running out. Lady Dorothea's visit might last a week, perhaps 2. While she was here, the household would be disrupted, routines would shift, and Mrs. Crane's iron grip on every corridor and staircase would be loosened. It was an opportunity, perhaps the only one she would get, the music room. She had to get into the music room. Tonight, we will take a very short break. If you do not want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The house fell silent at 11:30. Nell lay in her narrow bed in the attic dormitory, fully dressed beneath the thin blanket, listening to the sounds of the house shutting down around her. The creak of floorboards as the other maids settled, the distant clank of the kitchen range being banked for the night. The slow, heavy tick of the long case clock in the great hall below, counting out the minutes in a steady, relentless rhythm that seemed to echo the beating of her own heart. She had planned this with the care of a general preparing for a single engagement. She had noted during her time on the upper floors that the music room shared a wall with a smaller chamber whose door she had seen left ajar. If that room was still unlocked, it might offer a point of entry. It was thin hope, but thin hope was the only kind she had ever been given. She waited until the breathing around her deepened into the slow, heavy rhythms of sleep. Freda, in the next bed, murmured something unintelligible and turned over. The dormitory was dark, the only light a faint gray wash from the single skylight, where a half-moon sat behind a veil of cloud. Nell rose without a sound. She had practiced this too, easing her weight off the narrow mattress in increments, distributing it across the iron frame to avoid the squeal of springs. She had left her shoes under the bed. She would go in her stockings. Shoes made noise. Tonight, she would be a ghost. She carried no candle. She moved in the darkness, her right hand trailing along the wall. She reached the service stairs and descended, placing her feet at the edges where the wood was least likely to creak. Down one flight, then another. The second-floor corridor stretched before her, a long tunnel of shadow lit at its far end by a single window, through which the moon cast a pale blue-white rectangle on the floor. The music room was at the far end, past the window. The smaller room, the one she was counting on, was 3 doors before it on the left. She moved along the corridor with agonizing slowness, her stockinged feet silent on the runner. The portraits on the walls were dark shapes in the gloom, their gilded frames catching the faint moonlight in brief, cold glints. She counted doors. 1, 2, 3. She reached for the handle. Her fingers found the cold brass and turned it. The mechanism clicked, a tiny sound that in the absolute silence of the sleeping house was as loud as a pistol shot. She froze, listened. Nothing moved. She eased the door open and slipped inside. The room was small, barely larger than a closet, shelves of folded linen. A forgotten storage room. She felt her way to the far wall, the one shared with the music room. Her palms moved over the surface, pressing, testing, plaster over lath. Solid. She worked the entire length, her fingers probing every seam. Nothing. Her chest tightened with a familiar, crushing disappointment. She had gambled on a connection that did not exist. The wall was solid. The music room was sealed. She stood in the darkness, her forehead pressed against the cold plaster, and for a terrible lurching moment, she felt the full weight of her situation settle onto her shoulders. 2 years of loss, a year of destitution, a fortnight in this house, scrubbing and bowing and swallowing her pride, and now this, a dead end, a blank wall. She would not cry. She pressed her fist against her mouth and breathed through her nose until the wave passed. Then she turned to leave. Her hand was on the door handle when she heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, unhurried. Coming down the corridor. Her blood turned to ice. She flattened herself against the wall behind the door, her body rigid, her breath held so tightly her lungs burned. The footsteps grew louder, closer, each one a steady, measured report on the wooden floor. They were not the quick, furtive steps of a servant checking on a noise. They were the steps of someone who owned every inch of the floor beneath them. The Duke. The footsteps stopped, not at her door, but further along the corridor. At the music room, she heard the faint, metallic sound of a key being drawn from a chain, the scrape of it entering a lock, the heavy, definitive click of the mechanism turning. He was opening the music room. She heard the door swing inward. She heard his footsteps cross the threshold. Slower now, hesitant, as if the man who walked with such certainty through every other room in his house could not quite bring himself to enter this one without faltering. Then silence. A long, terrible silence, filled with the weight of a grief, so vast it seemed to press against the walls and seep through them, into the room where she stood hidden. Nell did not move. She did not breathe. Her mind, which had been consumed by panic, was now doing something else entirely. It was calculating. The music room was open. The Duke was inside it. The door was unlocked. If she waited, if he went inside and stayed, if he became absorbed in whatever private ritual had brought him here in the dead of night, she might be able to slip past the open door and see inside. She might be able to glimpse the layout, the shelves, the places where her father might have hidden his documents. Even a few seconds of observation would give her more than she had now, which was nothing. It was madness. It was reckless beyond anything she had yet attempted. If he stepped back into the corridor and found her there, in her stockings, at 2 in the morning on a floor she had been expressly forbidden to visit, no explanation on earth would save her. She eased the door open a crack. The corridor was dim, but the music room door, 4 paces to her right, stood wide open, and from inside it came a faint golden light. He had lit a lamp. She could see the edge of the door frame, the shadow of his figure cast long across the corridor floor. She opened the door wider, just enough to slip her body through the gap, and stepped into the corridor. 1 step. 2. She pressed herself against the opposite wall, moving toward the open door with the slow, measured stealth of a cat stalking in darkness. 3 steps. She could see into the room now, a narrow sliver of it visible past the edge of the doorframe. A pianoforte, draped in black cloth. Shelves of books and bound manuscripts. A music stand with a score still open on it, yellowed and untouched. And beyond it, against the far wall, a tall cabinet with glass doors, behind which she could see the spines of leather portfolios, dozens of them, arranged in rows. Her heart hammered so violently, she was certain he could hear it. That cabinet, those portfolios. If her father had hidden anything in this room, it would be there. She took 1 more step, and her hip caught the edge of a narrow hall table she had not seen in the gloom. A small porcelain vase rocked, tipped, and struck the table's surface with a sharp, ringing crack that split the silence like a gunshot. Inside the music room, the light shifted. A shadow moved. Footsteps, rapid now, crossed the room toward the door. Nell ran. She bolted for the service stairs, her stockinged feet skidding on the polished floor, and plunged into the darkness. Behind her, the Duke's voice cut through the dark. "Who is there?" She did not stop. She ran through the kitchens, up the back stairs to the attic, and slipped into bed fully clothed, shaking, her face pressed into the pillow, her heart trying to batter its way out of her chest. She had not been seen. She was almost certain of that. The corridor had been too dark, her flight too swift. He would have seen a shape, a shadow, nothing more. But he had heard the vase. He would know someone had been there. He would know someone had been outside the music room while it was open, and he would want to know who. In the music room, Calder stood in the doorway, the lamp raised, its light spilling across the empty corridor. He righted the porcelain vase and looked toward the service stairs. Nothing. Whoever had been there was gone. He stepped back inside. Nothing in the room had been touched, but someone had been watching him. Not a thief who would have gone to the silver. Not a curious servant who would not have fled with such desperate speed. Someone with a purpose. Someone who wanted something in this room. He thought of the girl, Nell, the one with the voice and the steady, unsettling calm, the one his aunt had described as a page written in invisible ink, the one who had been banished from this floor and would have every reason to resent that banishment. It was her. He could not prove it. He had not seen her face, had not heard her voice. But in the way that a hunter knows which animal has crossed a trail by the shape of its track and the weight of its tread, he knew. He sat down on the piano bench, the black cloth bunched beside him, and looked around the room he had not entered in 18 months. The light from the lamp cast long amber shadows across the shelves of manuscripts, across the music stand, across the glass-fronted cabinet on the far wall where Elspeth had kept her most treasured scores and correspondence. Why would a housemaid want something from Elspeth's music room? The question sat in the quiet room like a stone dropped into still water, disturbing everything he thought he knew. He did not lock the door when he left. He told himself it was an oversight, a lapse of concentration brought on by tiredness. But as he walked back to his own rooms, the key still warm in his hand, he knew it was not an oversight at all. It was an invitation. She went back the following night. She told herself it was necessity. The unlocked door was an anomaly that would be corrected by morning. If she did not seize this moment, it would close forever. She descended the service stairs at midnight. The house was quieter than it had been the previous night. She reached the second-floor corridor and paused, listening. Nothing. The moonlight was brighter tonight, the corridor painted in silver and charcoal. The music room door was ajar, not closed and unlocked as she had expected. Ajar. A sliver of warm light leaked through the gap and fell across the floorboards in a narrow golden stripe. Someone was inside. Her body went rigid. Every instinct screamed at her to turn, to flee back down the stairs, to abandon this reckless errand and retreat to the safety of her bed. But her feet would not move. The light held her the way a flame holds a moth, not with warmth, but with the irresistible gravity of something that cannot be looked away from. She took a step forward, then another. She reached the door and placed her fingertips against the wood. It swung inward without a sound, and the music room opened before her. Calder was sitting on the piano bench. The black cloth had been removed. The pianoforte stood exposed, its dark wood gleaming in the light of a single oil lamp that sat on a side table. The Duke was not playing. He was sitting with his hands resting on his thighs, his back straight, his gaze fixed on the keyboard as if it were a document he was trying to read in a language he had half forgotten. He was still fully dressed. He had not been to bed. He did not look up when she appeared in the doorway. He spoke as if he had been expecting her. As if this moment was not a surprise but a continuation of a conversation that had been progressing, in silence, for days. "Close the door," he said. Nell's breath left her in a thin, controlled stream. The game was over. He knew, perhaps not the details, perhaps not her name or her purpose, but he knew she had been here last night. He knew she was the shadow in the corridor, the one who had knocked the vase, the one who had fled. And he had left the door unlocked, and then ajar, and he had waited. She closed the door. She stood with her back against it, her hands flat against the wood, her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. "You were here last night," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, Your Grace." He nodded slowly, still not looking at her. His fingers moved absently to the piano keys, hovering just above the ivory without touching it, a gesture so instinctive and so filled with suppressed longing that it made her chest ache. "Why?" he asked. She said nothing. The truth was, a live coal in her mouth. She could not spit it out and she could not swallow it. "You were not here to steal," he continued, his voice low and measured. "A thief would not come to a room full of sheet music when there is silver on the ground floor. You were not here out of curiosity. A curious servant does not run like a hunted animal when she hears footsteps. You came here for a reason, and it was a reason worth risking your position, your livelihood, everything you have." He turned his head at last and looked at her. The lamplight carved his face into planes of gold and shadow, all sharp angles and deep hollows. His eyes, those dark, exhausted, searching eyes, held no anger. They held something far more dangerous. They held recognition. "Who are you?" he asked. The question hung between them like a struck chord, resonating in the silence of the room. It was not the question of a master to a servant. It was the question of one human being to another, asked across a gulf of station and circumstance, offered with a sincerity that was almost unbearable. "I am a housemaid, Your Grace," she whispered. He studied her for a long moment. Then he reached behind him to the side table and picked up a sheet of manuscript paper. It was old, yellowed at the edges, covered in handwritten notation. He held it out to her. "Tell me what this is," he said. Nell's heart stopped. She recognized the hand. She would have recognized it in her sleep, in her grave, at the end of the world. The notation was her father's. The elegant, slightly leftward-leaning script, the distinctive way he crossed his note stems, the tiny, precise, dynamic markings he placed beneath each phrase like whispered instructions. She could not speak. Her voice, that treacherous, irrepressible voice, had finally, completely abandoned her. "It was in the pianoforte bench," Calder said quietly. "Left there, I assume, by whoever last used this room before it was sealed. My wife treasured the work of a particular composer, a man she studied with, a man she spoke of with more admiration than she gave to almost anyone. His name was Matthias Leidcott. The name, her father's name, spoken in this room by this man was a blade that cut through every defense she had built. Her eyes filled with tears. She blinked them back savagely, furiously, but they came anyway, sliding down her cheeks in silent, burning tracks. "You know that name," he said. "Not a question." She nodded. She could not trust her voice. He rose from the bench and crossed the room to the glass-fronted cabinet. He opened it and took down a slim leather portfolio. He brought it to her and held it out, the way you hold out a lifeline to someone drowning. "This portfolio contains correspondence between Matthias Leidcott and my wife. It was filed here among her personal papers. I found it tonight while I was waiting for you." He paused. "The letters mention a daughter, a girl named Tamsin who had, according to her father, the purest natural voice he had ever heard." The room tilted. The lamplight blurred. Nell pressed her back harder against the door, her legs threatening to give way beneath her. "Sing for me," he said. The command was quiet. It was not cruel. It was not a trap. It was, she understood with a clarity that cut through her terror like light through glass. A test. The same kind of test a man gives when he already knows the answer but needs to hear it spoken aloud before he can act on it. She opened her mouth. For a terrible stretching moment, nothing came. Her throat was locked, her breath frozen, her body refusing the one thing it had been made to do. Then the air moved, and the sound came with it. Not the lullaby from the corridor, but something older, something deeper, a phrase from one of her father's nocturnes, the one he had written for her mother, the one that had no words because he had always said some things were too true for language. The sound filled the music room the way water fills a vessel, completely, inevitably, finding every corner, every crevice, every hollow space. It was not a performance. It was a confession. It was every silenced month, every swallowed melody. Every night she had pressed her face into a pillow and mouthed the words she could not speak. It was grief and defiance and longing and a sorrow so deep it had no floor, and it poured out of her in a single unbroken phrase that lasted perhaps 15 seconds and contained within it the entire compressed weight of her stolen life. When the last note faded, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full. It was the silence that follows a thunderclap, the silence that follows the breaking of something that cannot be unbroken. Calder was staring at her. His face, that carefully controlled, aristocratic mask, had cracked open. His eyes were bright, not with tears. He was not a man who wept, but with something equally raw, astonishment, reverence. And beneath them both, the first, tentative stirring of a fury that was not directed at her. "You will go back to your room," he said, and his voice was not steady. "You will speak of this to no one." "I will handle what comes next," she curtsied. It was automatic, absurd, the gesture of a servant in a moment that had obliterated every boundary between servant and master. She turned and opened the door. "Tamsin," he said. She stopped. The sound of her real name in his voice was like a key turning in a lock she had thought was rusted shut forever. "Your father's music is extraordinary," he said quietly. "Your voice is its equal." She fled before the sound that was building in her chest could escape. It was not a song. It was a sob. Mrs. Crane struck the following morning. She appeared in the library at 9 o'clock, her spine a rod of iron, her face set in the expression of vindicated authority that she wore like a suit of armor. She did not knock. She entered as if summoned. though she had not been, and stood before the Duke's desk with her hands clasped and her pale eyes blazing with the cold fire of a woman who believes she is about to win. "Your Grace," she said, dispensing with all preamble, "I must report a serious breach. The girl, Nell, was seen on the second floor last night. She left the servants' dormitory after midnight. I followed her myself and observed her attempting to enter the music room." Calder set down his pen. He leaned back in his chair and regarded the housekeeper with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It was not anger, it was not surprise. It was the flat, measuring look of a man recalculating the value of something he had once trusted without question. "You followed her yourself," he repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "I did, Your Grace. I have had concerns about this girl since her arrival. Her behavior is irregular. Her manner is presumptuous. And now she has been found prowling the forbidden areas of the house in the dead of night. The evidence is clear. She must be dismissed at once." Calder was silent for a moment that stretched like a wire pulled taut. "Describe what you saw," he said. "I saw her leave the dormitory. I followed her down the service stairs to the second floor. I saw her approach the music room door. And then I confronted her. She fled back to her room." "You confronted her," he said, his voice dropping to a register that made the housekeeper's confident posture falter by a fraction of a degree. "At what time?" "Shortly after midnight, Your Grace." "And where precisely were you standing when you confronted her?" Crane's face. She had rehearsed the accusation, but not the cross-examination. "In the corridor, Your Grace, outside the music room." Calder stood. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The authority in his bearing, the cold, compressed force of a man who had just been lied to by someone he had trusted for 2 decades, was more devastating than any shout. "I was in the music room last night, Mrs. Crane. I was there from midnight until nearly 2. The door was open. I was sitting at the pianoforte. No one confronted anyone in that corridor, because the only person in that corridor, apart from myself, was seen by me and by no one else." The color left the housekeeper's face in stages, like ink fading from a page held too close to a flame. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. The armor of her confidence disintegrated, and what remained beneath it was something small and exposed and deeply unpleasant. "Your Grace, you lied to me," Calder said. The words were quiet, precise, and absolutely final. "You fabricated an account. You claimed to have witnessed an event that did not occur in the manner you described. You did this to secure the dismissal of a member of my household staff, a girl who has given you no cause for complaint beyond the fact that her presence in this house appears to threaten you in ways I am only now beginning to understand." "Mrs. Sauk," Crane's composure broke. It was the crumbling of something built on rigidity, not strength, and like all rigid things, it did not bend. It shattered. "The girl will not be dismissed," Calder continued. "She will not be punished. She will be returned to her full duties on all floors of this house, and you will not interfere with her again. Those are my instructions, and they are not a subject for discussion." She understood what was happening. She was being diminished, her authority hollowed out, the foundation of her 20-year reign cracking beneath her feet. "You may go," the Duke said. She went. The door closed behind her with the soft, definitive sound of a chapter ending. Calder did not wait. That same morning, he sat at his desk and composed 2 letters. The first was to a solicitor in London, a man of impeccable reputation and absolute discretion, asking him to investigate the circumstances surrounding the death and estate of one Matthias Lidcott, composer believed to have died approximately 2 years prior. He asked specifically about any surviving family, any disputed inheritance, and any involvement by a man named Crane. The second letter was to his Aunt Dorothea, who had retired to her rooms with a headache that Calder suspected was entirely strategic. He asked her to join him in the library, at her earliest convenience. He had questions that required the particular kind of answers only she could provide. Lady Dorothea appeared within the quarter hour, her headache miraculously cured. "You knew," he said without preamble. "You knew there was something wrong about that girl." "I knew she was not what she pretended to be," his aunt said. "What have you discovered?" He told her everything. The singing, the midnight visits, the manuscript, the name Tamsin. She listened without interruption. "Mrs. Crane," she said at last. "What is her family name?" The question struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had not made the connection. He had been so focused on the girl, on the music, on the letters, that he had not thought to look at the other end of the thread. "She has never married," he said slowly, the realization dawning like cold light. "Crane is her family name. It has always been her name." "And the man who contested Lidcott's will?" "Horace Crane." The words came out flat, dead, stripped of everything but their terrible, clarifying weight. Her brother. The silence that followed was not the empty silence of the house. It was the loaded silence of a detonation about to occur. The solicitor's reply arrived 6 days later by express courier. It confirmed everything: the disputed will, the stolen estate, the disbarred solicitor, and a daughter named Tamsin Lidcott, dispossessed entirely, who had vanished from all records 14 months ago. Calder read the letter twice, then he folded it, placed it in his breast pocket, and walked upstairs to the music room. He searched the glass-fronted cabinet with a methodical intensity that bordered on ferocity. He removed every portfolio, every bundle of correspondence, every sheet of manuscript paper. He examined the shelves themselves, running his hands along the wood, pressing, testing. On the lowest shelf, behind a stack of bound scores, his fingers found an irregularity. A wooden panel that shifted when pressed. A compartment, cleverly concealed, no wider than a letter box. Inside, wrapped in a square of oilskin, was a sealed envelope. The handwriting on the front was the same elegant, slightly leftward-leaning script he had seen on the manuscript from the pianoforte bench. It was addressed to the Duchess of Hertford, marked private, and sealed with a plain wax disc. He broke the seal. "My dearest Elspeth," the letter began, "I write to you in confidence and in trust. As both a friend and a fellow lover of music, my health is failing, and I fear I have not much time remaining. I have enclosed, within the compartment where you will find this letter, the original deed to my property at Porthaven, and a signed copy of my true and final will, which leaves everything to my daughter, Tamsin. I do this because I have come to distrust my wife's cousin, Horace Crane, who has taken an unhealthy interest in my affairs and my estate. Should anything befall me before I am able to secure these documents with my solicitor, I beg you to see that they reach Tamsin's hands. She is all I have in this world, and she deserves the life I have tried to build for her. The nocturne I enclose is for you, with my gratitude for your friendship, your patronage, and the immeasurable gift of hearing you sing my music, as I always imagined it could sound." Beneath the letter, exactly as described, were 2 documents: a deed of title for a property called Morvering Cottage in Porthaven, Cornwall, naming the sole owner as Tamsin Matthias Lidcott, and a will, signed, witnessed, and dated 4 months before Matthias Lidcott's death, leaving the whole of his estate to his beloved daughter. Calder stood in the music room, the papers in his hands, and felt the full, devastating weight of a failure that stretched across years and deaths and silence. Matthias had entrusted these documents to Elspeth, and Elspeth had died before she could act on them. The letter had remained hidden, the will had remained sealed, and a young woman had been stripped of everything she owned and cast into a life of destitution, while the proof of her identity lay concealed behind a wooden panel in a locked room in a house of grief. His own house, his own locked room, his own grief. A cold, clarifying rage settled into his bones. It was not the hot, impulsive anger of a younger man. It was the deep, structural fury of a man who understood that justice is not an abstraction but a debt, and that this debt had been compounding, silently, catastrophically, under his own roof. He went to the bell pull and rang for the footman. "Bring Mrs. Crane to the music room," he said, "and then find Nell. Bring her here as well." Immediately, Mrs. Crane arrived first. She entered the music room and stopped dead. She had not been inside this room since before the Duchess's death. The uncovered pianoforte, the open cabinet, the scattered papers on the side table, all of it registered on her face as a series of small shocks, each one tightening the already rigid line of her mouth. But it was the expression on the Duke's face that drained the last of her composure. He stood by the cabinet, the letter and the documents in his hand, and he looked at her with an expression that was neither anger nor contempt but something far worse. It was understanding. Nell arrived moments later. She had been brought from the kitchens, her sleeve still damp, a smudge of flour on her cheek. She stepped into the room and her gaze went immediately to the papers in the Duke's hand. She saw the oilskin wrapping on the table. She saw the open compartment in the cabinet, and she understood in a single breathless instant what he had found. Her knees buckled. She caught herself against the doorframe, her fingers white against the wood, and stayed upright by force of will alone. Calder looked at Mrs. Crane. His voice, when he spoke, was low and controlled and carried the weight of something that had been a long time coming. "Do you know the name Matthias Lidcott, Mrs. Crane?" The housekeeper's face went the color of old wax. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Her eyes, those pale, authoritative, unyielding eyes, darted to Nell and then back to the Duke, and in that fractional glance was the unmistakable flicker of a woman who sees the trap closing and knows there is no way out. He was a composer, Calder continued, each word deliberate and unhurried, a scholar of music, a friend and teacher to my wife, and a man whose daughter was cheated of her inheritance by your brother, Horace Crane, who forged a will, bribed a solicitor, and stole everything a dying man had left to his only child. He held up the deed. This is the proof. Prox. A will, signed and witnessed, leaving everything to his daughter. A deed to a property your brother now occupies. And a letter from Matthias Lidcott to my wife, begging her to protect these documents because he feared, correctly, that his wife's cousin would steal them. He turned to Nell. His expression changed. The cold authority softened into something raw and unguarded, something that cost him visibly to show. "Is that not so?" he said. "Miss Lidcott, the name. Her name. Spoken in this room among her father's music by a man who was looking at her, not as a servant, not as a curiosity, not as a problem to be solved, but as a person who had been grievously wronged, and who deserved at last to be seen. The tears she had held back for 2 years, the tears she had swallowed during every cold night in borrowed beds, every humiliation in the laundry, every morning she had looked in the mirror and seen a stranger wearing her face, broke free. They came silently, without sound, without drama, sliding down her cheeks and falling onto the front of her gray uniform, darkening the fabric in small spreading circles. She nodded. She could not speak. She did not need to. Mrs. Crane made a sound. It was not a word. It was a small, strangled noise, the sound of something collapsing inward, a structure that had held for decades, finally giving way under a weight it was never designed to bear. "I did not know," she whispered. "My brother, he told me the father was in debt. He said the girl had no claim." "He said, he lied," Calder said. "And you chose to believe him. You chose to believe him because it was convenient, because it cost you nothing, and because the alternative that your brother was a thief and a fraud was a truth you did not want to carry." He set the documents on the pianoforte. The gesture was careful, almost tender, as if the papers were living things that could be bruised by rough handling. "But you did more than believe him, Mrs. Crane. You persecuted this woman. You saw her walk into your household, a young woman alone in the world, and instead of shelter, you gave her suspicion. Instead of kindness, you gave her punishment. You banished her from the only part of this house that could have restored what was taken from her, and when that was not enough, you lied to me, to my face, to have her removed entirely. The housekeeper's legs gave way. She sank onto the nearest chair, her hands gripping the armrests, her face a mask of devastation. It was not remorse. Nell could see that. It was the collapse of a woman whose entire identity had been built on authority and control, and who was now watching both dissolve like salt in water. "What will you do with me?" Mrs. Crane asked, her voice barely audible. Calder looked at Tamsin. Her face was wet, her eyes swollen, but in them he saw what he had seen from the very beginning, a dignity that suffering had not been able to extinguish. There was no vengeance in her expression. There was no triumph. There was only the exhausted, trembling relief of a woman who had been carrying a weight far too heavy for her and had finally been allowed to set it down. He answered accordingly. "You will leave Hartmere today. My aunt will arrange a position for you on one of her smaller holdings in the north. You will have a cottage, a modest income, and the privacy to live out your years without the burden of authority you have so thoroughly misused. It is more mercy than you showed Miss Lidcott, and it is more mercy than your brother will receive when my solicitors find him." Mrs. Crane did not argue. She did not plead. She rose from the chair with the slow, brittle movements of a woman who has aged a decade in 5 minutes, and she walked out of the music room without looking at either of them. The door closed. Tamsin and Calder were alone, standing in a room full of music and silence and the settling dust of a truth that had been sealed away for far too long. "These are yours," he said, pushing the documents toward her across the polished surface of the pianoforte. "They always were. My wife was entrusted with their safekeeping and she died before she could fulfill that trust. This house failed your father, and it failed you. I failed you. That is a debt I do not know how to repay." Tamsin wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Her voice, when it finally came, was raw and rough, scraped clean of all pretense. "You found them," she said. "You searched for them." "You did not have to do that." "I had every reason to do it," he said. And the way he said it, quiet and certain, and stripped of all formality, told her that he was not speaking only of justice or duty, or the obligations of a man whose house had been the unwitting instrument of her ruin. He was speaking of something else entirely, something neither of them was ready to name. "Stay," he said. The word fell into the silence like a single clear note. "Not as a maid, not as a guest. This house has a music collection that has been neglected for years, and it needs someone who understands what it contains. Someone who can restore what has been lost." He paused. "Someone who can bring sound back into these walls." She looked at him. She looked at the pianoforte, uncovered for the first time since it had been sealed. She looked at the cabinet where her father's letter had waited in the dark, patient as a seed, for the day the light would find it. "Yes," she said. 6 months later, summer came to Hartmere. It arrived, the way it always did, in Somerset, gradually, and then all at once the gray giving way to green, the damp surrendering to warmth, the hedgerows erupting in hawthorn and dogrose, until the lanes that wound through the estate were tunnels of white and pink. The house itself seemed to exhale, its windows thrown open for the first time in memory, its stone walls drinking in the long golden evenings. And there was music. It came from the second floor, from the room that had been sealed and was now the most alive space in the house. Tamsin had spent the spring cataloging and restoring the collection her father had helped build. Under her care, the room had been transformed from a mausoleum into a working archive, its shelves reorganized, its windows cleaned until the light poured in. She was no longer in gray. She wore a simple dress of cream linen, her dark hair loose past her shoulders. Her hands, which had been cracked from lye and cold water, had healed. They moved across the piano keys with a fluency that made the footmen pause in the corridor and listen, just as they had once paused for the Duchess. But Tamsin did not sound like Elspeth. She sounded like herself, and that, Calder had come to understand, was something rarer and more precious than any echo. The household had changed. A new housekeeper, Mrs. Pratian, Aldrin, recommended by Lady Dorothea, ran the house with quiet competence, and something Mrs. Crane had never thought to give respect. The notice on the baize board had been taken down. In its place was a framed card in Tamsin's hand that read simply, "Music is welcome here." Bertha sang in the kitchens now. Jem whistled openly. Freda had joined the village choir. The silence had not been replaced by noise. It had been replaced by something better, a quiet human hum of a household that had remembered what it felt like to be inhabited rather than endured. Calder stood in the doorway, watching Tamsin arrange scores on the upper shelf. She was on a rolling ladder, entirely absorbed, humming a low melody that drifted through the room like sunlight through water. He had changed, too. The hollows beneath his eyes had filled. The rigid, drawn quality of his face had softened into something that was still serious, still guarded, but no longer closed. He smiled now, not often, not easily, but with a warmth that transformed his severe features in a way that made Tamsin's breath catch every time she saw it. They had built something between them in these 6 months. Shared evenings in the music room where she played and he listened, long walks through the estate, meals in the small dining room where conversation flowed with a growing ease that surprised them both. It had grown the way music grows, one phrase at a time, each discovering harmonies neither could have predicted. Lady Dorothea observed all of this with satisfied vigilance. She said nothing. Some things are best left to unfold at their own pace. The solicitors had done their work. Horace Crane had been confronted with the original will and the testimony of his own disbarred lawyer. The stolen funds were being recovered. The cottage at Porthaven had been restored to Tamsin's name. She was Tamsin Lidcott again, a woman of means and standing. She did not need Hartmere. She did not need a position or a patron. She was free to leave, to return to Cornwall, to begin the life that had been stolen from her and was now, at last, her own. She had not left. "The new shelving looks well," Calder said from the doorway. Tamsin looked down at him from the ladder and smiled. "Your carpenter is a craftsman. He shaped the joins by hand. He works well under your direction," Calder said. "The entire household does. You have done what I could not. You have made this house feel like a home again." She descended the ladder. He offered his hand for the last step, and she took it. His grip was warm and firm and steady, and he did not let go immediately. Neither did she. "Will you walk with me?" he asked. "The light is good this evening. The meadows by the river are worth seeing." They walked through the grounds in the long amber light of a Somerset summer evening, past the walled garden where the roses were in full extravagant bloom, down the sloping parkland to the river that curved through the estate like a silver thread in green cloth. The air smelled of cut grass and warm earth and the faint sweet perfume of elder blossom. "The solicitors have confirmed the final settlement," Calder said, breaking the silence. "Porthaven is yours. The manuscripts are being recovered. You will be a woman of independent means, Tamsin." "I know," she said softly. "I have everything I came here to find." He stopped walking. He turned to face her. The evening light caught his eyes and turned them from dark brown to amber, warm and deep and filled with something he had spent 6 months learning how to feel again. "Everything?" he asked. She held his gaze. She did not look away. She did not defer or dissemble or retreat behind the careful composure that had been her shield for so long. She stood before him as herself, Tamsin Lidcott, the composer's daughter, the woman with the voice that had cracked open a house of silence, and she answered him with the same quiet honesty that had drawn him to her from the very beginning. "No," she said, Not everything. He took her hands, both of them. He held them the way he held everything that mattered to him, carefully, firmly, with the deliberate attention of a man who had learned, through grief and loss and the slow, painstaking work of healing, that the things most worth holding are the things you must choose to reach for. "I am not a man who speaks easily," he said, his voice low. "I have spent 18 months in silence, and before that, I spent a lifetime believing that restraint was the highest form of strength. But you have taught me that silence can be its own kind of cowardice, and I find that I have been a coward long enough." He drew a breath. "Your voice brought this house back to life. But it was not only the house, it was me. You walked into my grief and you did not flinch from it. You did not try to fix it or explain it away. You simply stood beside it and you sang, and the sound of your singing told me that it was possible to carry sorrow and still be alive. I do not want you to leave Hartmere, Tamsin. I do not want you to go to Port Haven or anywhere else. I want you to stay. Not as my curator, not as my guest, but as my wife, as the Duchess of Hartmere." The river moved beside them, catching the last of the light. The meadow grass bent in a warm breeze. Somewhere in the distance a blackbird was singing its evening song, liquid and unhurried, as if it had all the time in the world. Tamsin felt the tears come again, but they were different this time. They were not the tears of grief, or relief, or exhaustion. They were the tears of a woman standing at the edge of a life she had stopped believing was possible, and finding that it was not only possible but present, here, now, in the hands of a man whose silence had taught her the value of sound, and whose grief had taught her the shape of love. "Calder," she said, and it was the first time she had spoken his name. It felt like the opening note of a piece she would spend the rest of her life composing. "I did not come to Hartmere looking for you, but I found you, and I have been waiting very patiently for you to ask." He did not kiss her then. Instead, he lifted her hands and pressed them to his chest over his heart. She could feel it, beating strong and steady, the heart of a man who had come back from a long exile in the country of his own grief, and had found, waiting for him, a voice that sounded like home. Behind them, the windows of Hartmere Hall glowed amber, and from somewhere inside, faint and clear on the warm evening air, came the sound of Bertha singing in the kitchens. The melody drifted across the lawn and settled around them like a benediction. The great house was no longer silent. It was, at last, full of music.